chamber echoed with whispers, though none dared raise their voice. High above the obsidian floor of the council spire, the elder representatives loomed in silence, their faces masked not by fabric, but by the tradition of judgment. Earth's envoy stood alone at the center dais, spine straight, voice still. His words had long since ended. What remained was waiting. One by one, the sigils of each member species ignited in the air above the chamber, a slow spiral of shimmering verdicts. Red, 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 a scattering of blue, then more red. The envoy did not flinch. By the time the final vote seared itself into the dome, red, absolute, the silence broke into protocol announcements. A female voice, filtered through 70 dialects, confirmed the decision for all gathered to hear. Motion passed. Earth is to be exiled. Banishment protocol is to be enacted, effective immediately. There was no outcry, no protest. Earth had already spoken too many times in too many languages, only to be dismissed. The envoy bowed, once, low and measured, then turned from the council floor without another word. As the chamber reset itself for the next item of galactic order, not one of the elder delegates looked him in the eye. Orbiting Earth, the verdict arrived not as ceremony, but as deployment. Within hours, Admiral Jorik Salis of the 2nd Unified Hegemony Fleet had taken up position over Earth's primary trade ring. The old relay gates flickered, their worm paths sealed. Orbital beacons shifted broadcast frequencies, blinding Earth's outbound comms to the rest of known space. 1,000 satellites pivoted toward the blue world below, their sensor arrays blinking in patternless sync. The planet was not to be attacked nor destroyed. It was to be contained, studied, and with time, forgotten. In Silas's command center, crew members moved with quiet efficiency, unaware or perhaps uncaring that they now served as the guardians of a sanctioned world. He watched the pale curve of the planet below, arms folded, mouth drawn in a hard line. Earth had always been a problem. Fast, impatient, unwilling to yield to consensus. It built what it wanted, asked permission, rarely. And when denied, it learned to rephrase its questions as actions. That kind of species was dangerous. What Salis didn't know, what none of the Council truly grasped, was that Earth had known this was coming. 4 years before the final vote, under the guise of routine maintenance diplomacy, Earth's envoy corps had quietly planted digital phantoms into Council infrastructure. Not viruses, not malware, ghost protocols. Silent code, layered deep within beacon firmware, indistinct from security patches and calibration loops. The Council's own network scrubbers had signed off on every one of them. They didn't spread, they didn't signal, they waited. And when the last relay to Earth snapped shut, they listened, beneath the Earth's crust. Far below the satellite coverage and cloaked from orbital view, Director Marek Tolan stood in a chamber lit by ice-blue projection glass. Around him, engineers waited, silent, focused. This was not a war room. There were no blinking maps, no countdown timers, just a quiet acknowledgement between men and women who had known this day would come. Tolan placed one hand on the central console and keyed in a string of numbers. "Project Leviathan," he said. "Begin." In an instant, subcrustal vaults unlocked across Earth's moon and its nearest asteroid colonies. Facilities once labeled as terraforming research hubs surged to life. Power grids, long thought dormant, rerouted flow into shielded cores. Atmospheric filters kicked on, not to purify air, but to camouflage heat output. Deep ice silos groaned as blast doors retracted, and automated scaffolding began assembling long-stored alloy frames into skeletal warships. There were no alarms, no triumphant music, just machinery moving with absolute purpose. Earth had not prepared for forgiveness. Earth had prepared for return. On the surface, things appeared unchanged. Cargo drones drifted over megacities. Public feeds cycled through news reports about energy reform and atmospheric restoration efforts. Spokespersons gave carefully measured interviews, speaking of cooperation, regret, and compliance. A subtle narrative took root, that Earth, chastened by exile, would focus inward, heal, obey. But underneath the calm, trains ran on tracks no one could see. Engineers went missing from academic rosters. Whole factories shifted production in the dead of night. Children were taught new symbols in their history books, names not yet earned, ships not yet launched, victories not yet spoken. The world did not scream at its chains. It studied their length. Trade routes dissolved, supply chains snapped, relay gates darkened, but in Earth's subterranean grid, those watching the old beacons saw something different. From across the void, buried in static and regulatory pingbacks, the ghosts whispered. Status updates, positional drift, thermal variances from surveillance craft. Earth was blind but not deaf. And still, no message was sent. They would speak again, yes, but only when the language of submission was no longer necessary. On the final day of the first month in exile, Director Tolan stood again in the projection chamber. The lights were dimmed now, the air dense with pressure from active conduits and plasma routing channels. A screen showed the last commercial signal from Mars, cut mid-sentence. Another displayed Council naval paths rerouting without knowing why. Tolan didn't smile. He nodded once to the room. All of it's in motion, he said. Let them believe we're silent. He turned to leave, the sound of boots on steel ringing in the hum of machinery now alive and watching. Behind him, the engineers began working in shifts that would not end for years. Above, in orbit, Admiral Salis observed the quiet planet and said nothing. Below, Earth's lights blinked out on galactic scanners. But in its veins the real lights had just turned on. At first glance, the moon vaults still looked abandoned. Barren regoliths stretched across the surface, dotted with sensor-reflective boulders and the occasional half-buried antenna. Council surveillance drones buzzed over them in tight, predictable patterns, logging data that fed neatly into Salis's blockade analytics. The reports they relayed matched what was expected. Zero thermal output, zero motion, zero deviation from deactivation standards. From orbit, the vaults were quiet tombs. But inside, buried kilometers beneath the crust, Earth's real future was being carved into place with surgical precision. Director Marek Tolan stood before the central processor array of Vault Theta 3, hands behind his back, as he monitored atmospheric readouts that had nothing to do with weather. Above him, industrial cranes suspended the ribcage of a half-built ship, its hull sheathed in a dark, ripple-skinned composite made from recycled Verati sensor armor. The air reeked of ionic welding bursts and sealed coolant lines. Sparks danced along scaffolding like fireflies in a cavern. Technicians moved silently across magnetic walkways, adjusting braces and welding flight junctions. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Silence wasn't ritual here, it was survival. Tolan glanced at the nearby console where a junior engineer was patching data packets into the surveillance relay buffer. With a keystroke, she scrubbed heat signatures, spliced in archived footage of dormant vault interiors, and ran it through a program that rebuilt surface shadows consistent with orbital light. The feed would be flawless. It always was. For every satellite looking down, there was a shadow ready to lie. Elsewhere, in a crater misclassified as mineral dead, a second shipyard hummed with cloaked movement. Hollowed-out asteroid cores were being threaded with structural rails and drive modules, their outer shells reinforced with low-emission polymers. These shells would hold their shape even under pulse cannon stress and wouldn't give off a signature that standard Council scanning arrays could detect. Tolan hadn't built a fleet to flash or intimidate. He was building ghosts with teeth. Each ship had its own sub-team. They rotated between projects, shifting with no fixed pattern. None of them knew the full fleet design. No one needed to. A Corvette assembler from Theta might spend 2 months welding cooling fins, then be reassigned to lunar capacitor bays without warning. Oversight was segmented, and the deeper layers of command weren't engineers at all, but splicers, handlers, and signal forgers who made sure the data reported back to Salis's blockade showed only failures, delays, and resource shortages. It was in one of these shadow command modules, positioned deep beneath the Mare Fractis, that Lieutenant Rian Voss was introduced to the project. Young, clean-shaven, and marked by a calm that unnerved even his peers, Voss had never fired a rifle. He had no combat record, no naval pedigree, but he could walk through a broken firewall like it was a hallway. Years earlier, he had rewritten the orbital clearance codes for 3 Jovian stations without ever leaving his apartment. Now he was tasked with a different mission, to construct the net through which Earth would watch and manipulate its enemies. He called it the Veil Net. The Veil wasn't a single program. It was a lattice of microsignals, synthetic data trails, and scrambled return pings seeded into the Council's relay firmware through the same ghost protocols Earth had slipped in years before. Voss didn't hack systems. He rewrote their understanding of what normal was. Council scanners believed Earth's orbital infrastructure was inactive because they'd been taught that every energy pattern from the planet now aligned with failure. Even when Terran ships began limited engine testing, the signals registered as geological tremors. Whenever a coolant leak vented into space, the veil masked it as solar discharge. Voss didn't make Earth invisible. He made its activity look natural. Not that Earth did all this alone. While its engineers built in silence, others kept the engine rooms supplied. They came in fractured vessels, disguised as cargo haulers or retrofitted mining ships, arriving through encrypted jump routes buried in the Council's own routing garbage. Some bore false flags, others bore none at all. These were the black market smugglers, ex-Council citizens, fringe scavengers, and profit-minded operators who knew an opportunity when they saw one. Not all were mercenaries. Some came for what Earth promised, a future outside Council dictates, a way to matter in a galaxy where the old powers had long since carved the stars into bureaucratic cages. Tolan didn't ask their motives. He gave them coordinates, sent automated drones to retrieve cargo, and paid them through layered credit paths that couldn't be traced back to any planetary economy. In return, they delivered what Earth needed: alien armor fragments, decommissioned sensor grids, ion dispersal coils, and, most importantly, information. These were the veins that fed Leviathan. Inside Vault Theta 3, one of the Corvettes neared completion. Its wings were swept back like a predator in mid-dive, engine nodes housed within segmented compartments that allowed for low-velocity drift or quick propulsion when needed. There were no large cannon mounts, no overt displays of force. Its design was surgical. Get in, strike once, disappear. Voss entered the bay and stood with Tolan at the observation deck as they watched the crew detach the final scaffolding from the ship's underbelly. A moment later, a low pulse rippled across its hull, the activation of its cloaking skin. A shimmer of heat distortion rolled out in a slow wave. And then there was nothing. No ship, no glint of metal, only the vague suggestion of something there, pressed against the dark, like a void holding its breath. Tolan didn't turn. How soon can we replicate the cloak grid for the other units? Voss ran a finger down his datapad, scanning code loops. 39 days. 40, if we factor in phase calibration delays. Make it 37, take the beta grid offline, and reassign the techs. Voss didn't argue. He simply nodded once and walked out, his footsteps fading into the quiet hume of the bay. The Corvette remained in place, unseen. Somewhere above, Council satellites passed overhead, their lenses watching an empty crater. Everything in their data logs confirmed the truth. Earth was still broken, still grounded, still irrelevant. They had no idea that something had just vanished right beneath their eyes. The control chamber was buried beneath 20 meters of reinforced basalt and shielded against every known form of scan. It had no official designation, no surface entrance, and no memory in Earth's public grid. Those who built it were either dead or working off-world now, scattered across ghost installations that existed only as coordinates in a locked directory. Within that chamber, Lieutenant Rien Voss sat in silence, fingers hovering above a pane of reactive glass that pulsed in dull green with every subroutine's heartbeat. The veil net had expanded, but today it would speak. He leaned in closer, eyes narrowing as he located one of the original Ghost Protocol seeds. A dormant diagnostic tether inside a standard Council beacon, still logging its maintenance telemetry once every 72 hours. It had never been erased because no one had ever noticed it. Voss ran a resonance pulse along the tether, slow and steady like striking a tuning fork in the void. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the line blinked once. The seed had reawakened. Voss didn't smile. He never did when a plan worked. Instead, he spoke quietly into the command relay. "We're in." Across Council space, beacons blinked without blinking. Relays responded without knowing they had been questioned. The data traffic was immense, but the code knew where to hide. It slipped between calibration logs, snuck into idle system chatter, rewrote heat patterns from Earth's surface to match an artificial drought. There was no sudden takeover, just a slow drift of reality, recoded line by line. On the Council's side, the story was clear. Earth was suffering. Atmospheric rot, failed infrastructure, starvation curves tracking upward. Even satellite re-entry patterns were reclassified as debris from defunct orbital stations. Back on Earth, the truth looked nothing like the data. Farms were stable. Atmospheric scrubbers were operating at 94% efficiency. Power grids extended to even the old highland zones. Cities that were supposed to be abandoned were still alive. Quietly, efficiently, but alive. The trick wasn't just in making the Council see the wrong picture. It was in making them believe they hadn't seen anything at all. Voss worked with few others. His team, called the Trace Division, consisted of less than a dozen cyber strategists, hand-picked from Earth's final class of system engineers before the exile. They lived in shifts, slept underground, and barely spoke outside briefings. Their task wasn't hacking, it was misdirection. If a Council AI queried satellite logs, the Trace Division fed it a loop from 7 weeks ago. If a thermal scan swept a moon base, the net mimicked shadow decay across rock strata to show only cold stone. The enemy wasn't blocked. It was obeyed. With lies shaped like facts. In the Hecron sector, a cold bureaucratic outpost deep within Council territory, one analyst began to notice the shape of these lies. His name wasn't known on Earth. A junior operations assistant, 2 years into his first term, assigned to sensor interpretation for low-threat zones. He had no power, no voice in the Council chambers, but he had instinct, and something in the data felt wrong. He couldn't say what it was. Not precisely. The timing of orbital reports seemed too perfect, the decay curve of Terran infrastructure too symmetrical. He ran cross-checks between beacon signals and indirect traffic logs and saw a flutter. Tiny inconsistencies, just milliseconds of signal delay where none should be. He flagged it, noted it, sent it upward for review. The review never came. 3 days later, his workstation powered down mid-cycle. His access credentials vanished from the system. Colleagues were told he had transferred to an off-world diplomatic liaison program. No record existed of such a program. His name was quietly removed from the roster wall. On Earth, Voss read the incident with no emotion. One of the side effects of control was risk. Occasionally someone would hear the echo in the hallway and follow it too far. He didn't relish these cleanups, but he didn't hesitate either. This was a silent war, and Earth's greatest weapon was not firepower. It was belief. Belief that the enemy had already won, that Earth was too fractured, too starved, too crippled to resist. The veil made sure that belief endured. Even Admiral Jorik Salis, positioned directly above Earth, believed it. His blockade adjusted weekly based on the Council's algorithmic threat assessments. None of those assessments had flagged any anomalies. Council AI supervisors reported successful surveillance. Atmospheric decay was consistent, orbital patterns unchanged. Earth was a dull object now, rotating slowly in the dark, barely worthy of a full scan. Still, the Admiral held position. He had no interest in pity. He simply followed orders. The planet posed no danger, but it wasn't yet forgiven. Best to keep watching. So his ships orbited. His drones passed overhead. His sensors continued to pull false data from a world they believed was dying. They adjusted altitude, rotated formations, all precisely as Earth predicted they would. But Adams doubted with his mind, leaping back to the and all while guarding nothing but phantoms. Below the crust, Voss stood and turned off the panel. Around him the air was still. The trace division had already rotated out, new hands taking their place, trained in silence. In the chamber's corner, a holopap projected Council surveillance routes. Every curve, every satellite, every rhythm of orbit, they moved like clockwork. Exactly how Earth wanted them to. He picked up his tablet, issued the next sequence update, and walked out without speaking. The chamber dimmed behind him, returning to quiet. Above, the blockade adjusted again. 3 ships moved 6 degrees to starboard. 1 replaced a drone in geosync orbit. Sensors recalibrated, readings refreshed. La Torre, Earth remained invisible. And the Council, convinced of its success, watched an illusion they themselves maintained. The Helix Ring was never meant to be broken. A fortified perimeter of outposts, sensor relays and weapons satellites spanning nearly a third of the old Council frontier, it had stood for over a century as a symbol of deterrence. No hostile force had ever made it past the outer stations. Even rogue factions with stolen tech had been reduced to vapor before reaching the inner curve. It was not just a defense line, it was a monument to control, which is why no one expected it to vanish before anyone had time to scream. The first strike didn't arrive with explosions. It came with silence. On an unremarkable cycle shift, as the third watch rotation took over at Outpost 17K, the satellite uplinks to the core AI servers blinked and returned null. The techs, assuming atmospheric interference or standard latency, ran diagnostics. Before those finished loading, the doors to the reactor bays locked behind them. The lights dimmed, and every terminal began rewriting its own code. A moment later, plasma coolant ignited inside the stabilizers. There were no survivors. And no alarms. At the same moment, nearly 45,000 kilometers away, 3 stealth Corvettes burst from eclipse position behind a fractured moonlet and moved in formation through the outer edge of the ring. They weren't fast. They didn't need to be. Each was masked under heat-scattered hull plating and carried a single gravitic lance, designed not to destroy, but to delete. They fired in sequence, their weapons emitting no flare, no signature, only a ripple in mass that folded the satellite nodes like cloth. The central comms array blinked once, then it, too, went dark. Inside the flagship Valkyrion, Earth's first fully commissioned warship since the exile, Commander Rian Voss stood on the primary bridge with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't bark orders, he didn't pace. He simply watched the real-time holofeed of satellite telemetry flicker and drop away, one node after another. Every point of Council surveillance was disappearing in quiet sequence. What the Council had thought was a crippled world had just unfolded its wings beneath their blindfold. Behind him, the Digital Warfare Division was already working the second phase. The Revery Virus, an exploit so deeply woven into the Council's AI firmware that it could only be triggered by mimicking their own diagnostic language, had been deployed simultaneously across the relays. It did not announce itself. Instead, it posed as a routine system integrity check, gaining root access before feeding one simple instruction: you are under attack from your own fleet. The confusion was instantaneous. Outposts began broadcasting distress signals, demanding confirmation of enemy identification. No confirmations came. The AIs reclassified each other as potential threats. Fleet coordination faltered. Internal defense algorithms turned to isolation protocols. Ships broke formation. In the span of 20 minutes, the entire Helix Ring lost its eyes and ears, and, worst of all, it believed the loss was its own fault. Council command centers, hundreds of light-years away, struggled to make sense of the flood of corrupted data. Was it a rebellion? A virus? A mutiny? Every answer pointed in different directions. Meanwhile, Voss gave the command to move. Terran ships advanced, not in a wave, but like surgical instruments. Frigate-class vessels looped beneath the Council's disabled patrol lanes. Destroyers with gravitic anchors bypassed standard navigation entirely, skipping across micro-singularities designed for transit tunnels. They didn't fire on civilians. They didn't demand surrender. They simply erased military infrastructure with clockwork precision, hitting data nodes, fuel depots, and communication spires before the targets even understood what was happening. Then they reached the Serak Corridor. This stretch of space, once Earth's primary trade lane before exile, had been heavily patrolled since the banishment. Council doctrine stated it would never again transmit Terran signals. That doctrine ended the moment Valkyrion entered the corridor and opened a wideband transmission on all known diplomatic frequencies. The message was short. It was delivered in clean galactic standard, spoken with no emotion. Earth recognizes its own return. This corridor is now Terran-controlled space. Council surveillance is no longer required. We advise a reassessment of all surrounding deployments. The words weren't aggressive, they weren't angry, and that made them all the more terrifying. For the Council, this was impossible. Earth had been banished, broken, monitored, studied, and now it was broadcasting. Not with a distress signal, not with a plea, but with declaration. That signal echoed through over a dozen systems before the Council could jam the frequency. But it was too late. It had been heard. And worse, it had been believed. In the following hours, Council fleets scrambled, orders conflicted. Some commanders raced toward the Serak Corridor to intercept. Others were paralyzed by the chaos in the ring. The Revery Virus continued to spread, its mimicry infecting fallback routines and command hierarchies. Fleets that had never lost a simulated battle now couldn't tell whether their own escorts were friend or foe. Automated defense grids locked targeting systems and refused to disengage. Commanders gave contradictory orders that fed into the loop. Earth didn't fight the fleets directly. It let them tear themselves apart, chasing threats that didn't exist. Every time a Council vessel prepared for conflict, the Terran fleet had already vanished, leaving behind cold space and a ghost signature routed through 10 different relays. It was like trying to trap fog in a net. Back on Valkyrion, Voss watched the chaos unfold with the same stillness he always wore. His officers worked with quiet precision. No one celebrated. This wasn't the war. This was the signal. He stepped forward, keying a private channel routed through a secure ghost relay, still hidden in the Council's own beacon architecture. The line transmitted once, cutting through the static. "We're back," Voss said. "Send your response." Then he closed the channel, stepped away from the console, and returned to his place at the center of the bridge. No music swelled. No cheer rose. Outside, space remained as silent as ever. Except now, that silence belonged to Earth. The war archives were not open to the public. Even most Council officials had never stepped inside. Hidden beneath the crust of a quarantined moon near the Triadine cluster, the archives contained more than records. They housed consequences. Digital renderings of extinct species, holograms of planets turned black and silent, tactical breakdowns of rebellions that ended not in treaties, but in systemic erasure. No lights flickered here. The temperature was kept low, not for preservation, but to remind those who entered what silence felt like after surrender failed. Admiral Keth Van stood alone before a wide-paneled display, arms folded behind his back, watching the final engagement of the Tarth enclaves. On the screen, a small flotilla tried in vain to retreat through a collapsing gate, their cries for negotiation ignored. Behind them, the Hecron Vanguard descended. 12 vessels in formation, firing without pause, without demand. By the time the transmission ended, the flotilla no longer existed. Only debris marked where lives had once gathered hope. Van didn't blink. The Vanguard wasn't built for dialogue. It was made for certainty. Behind him, the chamber doors hissed open. A liaison from the Council Senate entered, robes stiff, expression set in brittle calm. "You've seen the feed," he said. "You know what they did." Varen nodded once. "I've also seen what we've failed to do. We watched them too long. They watched us back." The liaison didn't argue. Debate had ended before he'd even arrived. In the upper tiers of the Senate chamber, the conversation had followed a familiar trajectory. Moderates calling for dialogue, for a controlled inquiry into Earth's apparent resurgence, while hardliners demanded immediate response. Not retaliation, not warning, eradication. The broadcast from the Serak Corridor had rattled them, not because it declared war, but because it didn't. The calm in the message had been deliberate and devastating. Earth hadn't screamed, it hadn't begged, it had informed. That was worse than provocation, it was confidence, which meant capability. So the decision was made, the Vanguard would deploy. Across the command strata, the hardliners moved quickly. The vote wasn't unanimous. 12 systems abstained, citing past intelligence that warned against military escalation. Others urged for reassessment, or at the very least reclassification of Earth from contained hostile to emerging power. But none of it mattered. The Hecron Vanguard didn't wait for consensus. They only waited for a destination. The ships emerged from stasis within hours. Ancient monolithic vessels carved from the alloy of long-dead stars. Each carried autonomous kill grids, self-contained atmospheres, and redundant command AI trained to adapt without central feed. They were not elegant, they were not beautiful. They were built to end things. Entire planets had changed course simply from seeing their approach on long-range scanners. Admiral Van oversaw the calibration from his flagship, Mooncaster, watching as the navigational signatures adjusted for Silar Rift incursion. The Rift was a calculated choice. Asteroid-dense, sensor-confusing, but narrow enough that once the Vanguard entered, Earth would have little space to maneuver. They were banking on precision, overwhelm, spectacle. As the fleet aligned, Earth's networks stirred. On the VeilNet's edge, inside one of the deep cryptographic nodes near Neptune's shadow, the jump signature was caught the moment it initiated. The timing, the energy curve, the movement of mass, none of it escaped Voss's attention. He watched the data cascade across the display, even as alarms in Council territories hadn't yet sounded. He knew what it meant the moment he saw the displacement pattern. The Hecron Vanguard was coming. Inside Valkyrion's command bay, technicians exchanged glances. Whispers began. Some called it suicide, others called it confirmation. But only one voice mattered, and when Commander Voss mattered, he didn't ask for the report. He didn't ask what the data showed. He simply said, "Let them come." His officers straightened. No battle plans were unfurled, no desperate messages sent. Every ship in the fleet already knew its place. Every route through the rift had been modeled, remapped, memorized. Every asteroid that could serve as cover, every vector that could collapse into a sink point under gravitic pressure had been calculated and recalculated 100 times over. Because Earth had never trusted that exile would be permanent. It had never trusted the Council to leave them alone. And the fleet they had built was not a plea for peace. It was a warning, one that the Council, in their arrogance, had finally chosen to test. So now the test would begin. And the Hecron Vanguard, this Empire's proud, undefeated sword, was going to learn whether ghosts could bleed. Above them, across the rift, space prepared to close its fists, and neither side would leave untouched. The Silar Rift stretched like a wound across the void, a jagged swath of drifting rock and gravitational shears that made standard fleet movement suicidal. Spanning nearly 8 million kilometers at its widest point, it was a tangle of fractured moons, long frozen gas remnants, and time-warped debris from a collapsed binary system. Most charts marked it as impassable. The Council had long assumed no sane military would choose to engage here, but Earth had never intended to fight where battles were expected. The first Terran ships were already in place when the Hecron Vanguard crossed the boundary. They didn't wait for the enemy to breach fully, nor did they form traditional lines. Instead, the Valkyrian and its escorts scattered like smoke, shifting through microcurrents in the rift's gravity, threading paths that appeared random to untrained sensors, but followed a precise logic honed over years of simulations. No ship moved alone. Every vessel operated in triads: hunter, shadow, decoy, interlinked through encrypted quantum channels, independent of any single command node. Even if Valkyrian fell, the battle would continue. The Vanguard advanced with ritual precision, their formation unshaken by the field's chaos. These were ships designed to operate in deep space, forged to absorb planetary bombardment. They activated sublayer shielding grids, anchored stabilization pylons into the rift's slow-moving mass, and began deploying wide-range pulse sweeps to burn out cloaks and flush hostiles from hiding. But the pulses came back dirty, distorted by interference that wasn't natural. The Terrans had salted the rift with signal feedback pods, micro-relays that scrambled direction, location, even depth perception. Then came the first detonation. A sync lance fired from behind a frozen ridge, its mass-core charge spiking gravity in a localized field for less than 4 seconds, just long enough to wrench one of the Vanguard's forward frigates into the side of a drifting planetoid. The impact didn't cause an explosion. It folded the ship, warping its spine until it snapped in two. No alarms, no warning. Just the instant shattering of pressure integrity and the silence that followed. It was not a kill for glory, it was surgical erasure. The Hecron response was immediate. Their second line fanned out to triangulate fire toward the origin point. But the Terrans had already moved. Pulse rounds fired from angles that didn't make sense, from underneath the very rocks the Vanguard had been using as cover. Council's sensor logic couldn't adapt. Earth's ships weren't using impulse engines or standard thrust. They moved in erratic pulses, using gravitic shunts to leap small distances without burning heat signatures. To the enemy, they appeared and vanished like flickering ghosts. As the Council tried to regain control, their flagship, the Oranthis Maul, pushed forward into the rift's denser zone, trusting its armor and deep AI predictive matrix to power through. But it wasn't speed or firepower Earth had prepared for. It was predictability. A trail of drone beacons, programmed with Terran engine signatures and reactive echo loops, lured the flagship toward what looked like a cornered formation of smaller Earth vessels. The AI on board Oranthis Maul read it as an opportunity to crush resistance and force surrender. It calculated intercept, adjusted bearing, deployed secondary batteries, and accelerated. Voss watched from Valkyrion's inner chamber, seated before the tactical shell, a sphere of real-time battlefield data that rendered everything in movement not simple. He didn't speak until the flagship crossed the invisible mark the fleet had designated as Point Zero. Then, with quiet precision, he tapped the activation key. The Singularity anchor detonated. Not an explosion. Not a weapon in the traditional sense. The anchor collapsed a controlled pocket of space into itself, generating a sudden well of gravity that snapped the rift's debris field into motion. Asteroids slammed into each other at unnatural speeds, magnetic fields inverted, and directly beneath the Oranthis Maul, the space it occupied twisted. For a moment the ship seemed to ripple. Its hull stretched inward as if trying to flee its own outline. Internal structure caved, engines folded. The sound inside the rift, transmitted only through ship hulls and metal, was not a boom, but a deep metallic groan, like a scream trapped in iron. The Aranthis Maul vanished. What remained was a spiral of shrapnel and rotating fragments, each one reflecting the last image of the ship's own death back into space. The Vanguard hesitated. They were machines, yes, but machines driven by layered protocol. And when Flagship Command ceased transmitting, fallback systems split the fleet into pre-assigned contingencies. Those contingencies had been written decades ago. They had not accounted for an enemy that could vanish mid-shot or collapse space beneath their feet. Orders conflicted, ships recalculated, target locks failed. Terran triads seized the moment. One by one, precision strikes gutted isolated enemy vessels. No broadside engagements, no drawn-out fights, just sudden impacts, hull fractures, and gravitic pulses that ended systems before they could react. By the time the Vanguard recognized the trap for what it was, they had already lost formation. The rift was no longer terrain. It had become a weapon. Every asteroid a potential cover, every drift pattern a pre-modeled ambush route. Earth hadn't just prepared for the battle, they had made the field itself into their ally. The Vanguard didn't retreat, not openly, but their engines shifted vector, redirecting power to evasive systems. The core line of warships began pulling out of the central rift, no longer chasing ghosts, now fleeing them. Council doctrine had no term for this. The Hecron fleet had never turned its back before. On the bridge of Valkyrion, no one raised their voice. Tactical readouts continued to update, but the data was clear. The unthinkable had happened. The Vanguard was breaking. Voss didn't speak right away. He watched until the last of the fleeing ships exited the rift's far side, their path staggered and off-rhythm, before he finally turned to his officers and said what they already knew. "We've never seen the galaxy fight like this." The orbital towers had stood idle since the days before exile, forgotten monoliths of a different era, when Earth still believed it might earn its place through compliance. Now they were lit again, not in celebration but in mourning. Across the surface of each structure the names began to appear, etched by plasma filaments, one letter at a time, in a slow-burning crawl that marked every soul lost in the rift engagement. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just the cold hum of orbit and the weight of 9,000 names flickering into being against the black. Below, on Earth's surface, people stood in silence, watching the sky. The towers were visible from every continent, each rotating slow enough that their glowing inscriptions could be seen passing over the curvature of the planet like solemn stars. Some families held candles. Others stood with hands pressed to their chests, whispering names they hadn't known were lost until now. The media didn't broadcast interviews, no one asked for statements. The grief was not political, it was personal. A world that had survived exile now had to survive victory. And far from Earth's atmosphere, just past the orbit of Mars, Moon Colony 3 remained dark. Once a thriving hub of experimental biotech research and resource fabrication, it had served as a forward node for Earth's silent buildup. It had no weapons, no fleet, only engineers, scientists, and their families. The retaliation had come fast, a final gesture from a splintered council patrol lost in the confusion following the Vanguard's collapse, as they had struck out of desperation, not strategy, using kinetic bombardment to ensure no trace of the colony would remain. There had been no warning, no survivors, only silence. Commander Voss had seen the data himself, hours before the public confirmation. He hadn't spoken. He had simply stood, arms folded behind his back, watching the final ping from the colony vanish from the system feed. Others in the command chamber had waited for orders. Some expected retribution. Some expected silence. But what Voss did was neither. He walked to the central console, keyed in a private line to Earth's Provisional Council, and requested a full audit of command authority. Then he stepped back and made his decision final. He would not lead the fleet any longer. Earth's people had built their return with strength. But strength, he reminded them, was not the same as power. Power came with permanence, and permanence bred tyranny. He had seen what the Council had become: rigid, paranoid, deaf. Earth could not afford to become its mirror. So Voss stepped down. The announcement came as the towers still burned with names, a single transmission distributed to every fleet node and planetary relay. It bore no dramatic phrasing, no claims of sacrifice or legacy, just the quiet transfer of command to a civilian oversight council composed of Earth's elected representatives. The fleet would remain active, but no longer as a military instrument. It would operate under defensive doctrine only, one that Earth's people could shape, debate, and amend. Voss returned to a quiet berth aboard Valkyrion, where he remained, no longer commander, no longer the face of Earth's defiance. He had done what he came to do. In the Council, silence had given way to chaos. The emergency conclave, convened in haste across multiple systems, was a cacophony of fractured voices. Some senators screamed for a renewed assault, demanding that Earth's fleet be labeled a destabilizing threat to galactic order. But their words rang hollow now. Too much had shifted. Too many allies had seen the rift unfold and recognized not aggression, but precision, discipline, restraint. 11 systems stood and called for reform. Not for Earth alone, but for the Council itself. They cited the failure of the blockade, the blindfolding effect of old doctrines, the arrogance of thinking exile would erase resolve. They called for Earth's conditional reinstatement as a sovereign power, not a subject, not an observer, but a voice. One with limits, yes, but one that could no longer be denied. 3 member species abstained from all future enforcement actions, citing ethical failure and procedural corruption in the banishment protocol itself. Their ships began to withdraw from Council fleets still orbiting enforcement zones. One ambassador publicly stated that Earth had demonstrated more control in battle than the Council had in governance. There were still hardliners, still bitter voices who vowed to rebuild the Vanguard, to strike back when Earth's guard dropped. But their words were softer now. They were no longer commands, they were noise. Because for the first time in generations, the Council chamber no longer feared a rival. It feared a mirror. And in the quiet that followed, Earth did not gloat. There were no triumphant declarations, no demands, no reparations requested. Only the same message broadcast once more through every open frequency Earth could reach. We didn't return to rule, we returned to be heard. There were corridors in the Council's broadcast towers that had once flowed with certainty. Streams of news, directives, diplomatic proclamations. Earth had once appeared early in those broadcasts, often as a problem. Then, for years, it disappeared entirely. Its name redacted from rosters, its channels purged. But now it had returned, always mentioned last. Not out of dismissal, not out of custom, out of caution. Broadcasters hesitated, their voices carried an edge when they arrived at Earth's name, as if the syllables themselves had grown sharp. Some paused just a beat too long, others emphasized the word differently, as though searching for a tone that wouldn't betray their uncertainty. Earth was no longer a subject of punishment. It was a subject of speculation, the kind that turned nervous systems against themselves. In Council academies across dozens of systems, the Rift maneuver was now part of military doctrine. Entire lectures were devoted to how Earth had weaponized terrain, how predictive modeling had failed, how decentralized command allowed a fleet to strike without needing orders. Cadets, many of them from species who once called Earth primitive, now watched simulations of the engagement and were asked, "How would you respond to this?" Most got it wrong. A few called it impossible. A handful simply sat in silence, knowing that the right answer had come too late for the Vanguard. On Titan, The coldest moon to ever bear a flag, the statue was carved from pressure-forged iron, smelted from the wreckage of ships recovered after the rift. The figure was neither soldier nor leader. It was a silhouette without detail, an anonymous form, standing straight beneath a sky of eternal cloud. Its face was left blank, deliberately. Around the statue no banners waved, no speeches were scheduled. The visitors arrived quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes in families, sometimes in full uniform. They stood, read the plaque beneath the feet of the silent figure, and left, changed. It said only, "They exiled us. Then they learned." On Earth, schools no longer taught exile as a wound, but as a threshold. Young students studied not just what was done to their world, but how it had responded. They learnt names not just of the commanders, but of the engineers who welded under Moonrock, of the coders who made lies look like truth, of the families lost on Colony 3. They didn't memorize dates, they memorized decisions. Elsewhere, in quiet council halls where echoes used to serve the powerful, new questions emerged. What kind of enemy does not retaliate with conquest? What kind of power refuses to seize more? What kind of fleet returns not to take, but to remain visible? And most frightening of all, what kind of people would wait that long in silence and build something in the dark? Next chamber atop the central conclave spire, an alien delegate turned toward Earth's newly seated ambassador. He was old, scaled and silver, from a species known for oration and endless historical reference. He asked the question without aggression, without fear, but not without dread. What will the humans do next? Earth's ambassador didn't answer, not with words. He simply smiled, a small, knowing gesture, not cruel, not boastful, but clear. Across the stars, silence followed. And behind that silence, the galaxy listened. As you were sitting in that council chamber, and saw Earth's ambassador smile without a word, what would you think the humans would do next? Let us know in the comments down below. And if this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY tales.